Hello everyone and welcome. Today I've got something easy and something effective as well. It is a cable generator, but it's not your usual curve to cable, your draw cable between points. It's going to be a scatter cables throughout your entire scene kind of thing, right? Because I'm lazy and I just want to sometimes I want to fill up a world or a background with cables, because cables add a lot of vibe, a lot of depth and skill as well, sense of skill. So, well, I just want to add that from time to time. So how do we do that? Well, I'm gonna make a generator out of it and I'm gonna show it to all of you so you can follow along nicely. So I've got a few fake little buildings set up from the start and that I'm gonna use. I have it in a collision collection. I'm gonna delete that so we are all starting from the same fresh position. So this is our basic scene. So build your world and add all the objects that you want to have cables on to one collection. Press M, new collection, and call this whatever. Collision is what I'm gonna name that. And well, that is going to be perfect. Now let's hit Shift A, mesh plane, and well, we don't really need the plane, but we need to have something to add a geometry node to, right? So I have this little window. If you don't have that right now, just drag your screen from the top right to the left and set this to geometry node editor and hit new, all right? And here we have it, where the magic happens. So you can imagine that if we need cables to be added on our buildings, on our geometry, we need that as an input right from the start, right? So I'm gonna add the collision collection right there. And let's just connect that straight from the start. There we go. Now I want to add something to those buildings. I don't want to have the buildings themselves, but we want to add cables to it. And we want to distribute that onto the sides of the building. Right, so let's hit Shift A and search for distribute points on faces. Right, so that is usually a great way to start if we need to scatter something around. So this is going to be our initial information, right? And information is what I mean with the normal and rotation. Normal direction of those points is incredibly important, and we're going to be using that a lot. And what I'm going to do right from the start is I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to hit store named attribute. The reason why, and set this to vector, the reason why is because I want to store my normal in the value there, and let's name this normal. You don't have to do this, but I want to use it later when our tree is a bit longer. We go all the way to the right. I don't want to keep reconnecting this from the left all the way from this little outputs. So with a store named, I can just access this at any time with a named attribute, right? Set that to vector and set this to normal. And then we have the same basically, but we don't have to grab it from the start every single time. Beautiful. Now I want something to be placed on those points. And what is that? Well, it is going to be an instance first. So instance on points, there we go. And let's add for the instance a single little point. There we go. Now you may wonder, why don't we just use the points from the distribute points? Well, I've tested it and it doesn't work the same way, sadly. So we need the instance on points as a little in-between step. All right, so I'm gonna drag my output to the right. There we go. And after the instancing, I want this to be realized, right? I don't want instances, I want real little points that I can control later. Shift A, realize instances. There we go. And with those instances, I'm gonna turn them right away into vertices. So Shift A, find points to vert. That's volume, points to vertices. There we go. And now we have vertices, right? Beautiful. So now we can actually access the vertex to extrude it somewhere else, like a cable. So hit Shift A and find an extrude mesh. There we go. And I don't want to extrude faces, but I want to extrude my vertices. There we go. Now the direction is a little bit weird here. So I want the direction, the offset, to be, you guessed it, my normal. So drag that out to a named attribute and set this to be your normal. There we go. Now from time to time, you may have a little issue where not all your normals are correct. And there's two kind of possibilities there. Now, number one, always check your normals by going to the overlay tab and set this to face orientation. Now, this seems to be okay, but I duplicated these buildings. And if I go to the item tab, we can see that we got a minus a scale, and that matters. So I'm going to select all the buildings on the right with Alt Z X-ray enabled. And well, we can just select everything. It doesn't really matter. Just press Ctrl A and apply all transforms. There we go, it's fixed. Right, let's just recheck our normals for one time. Everything is nice and blue, and let's just disable that now. Right, so now everything is extruded outwards, but I don't want cables on the top nor on the bottom. So how do we fix that? Well, quite easy. We need to delete a little bit of geometry, so delete geometry. And I want to delete only the top and the bottom, which means we have to compare the normal directions of each face, right? Which is very easy because we already have that here. We can just drag this out to a compare. And I want this to be, let's say, less than, it doesn't really matter. And element-wise, I'm going to set that to direction. Reason why is because we have an angle value that we can play around with later. For example, for some angled buildings or for curved or rounded tops of the buildings. And now we have a result that we can connect to the delete geometry. Right now, it won't delete anything, and the reason why is because we don't have a vector specified that is going to compare it to. Right, so I want a Z direction, of course, because I want to compare my angle to the Z vector, to the Z direction. And, well, I'm just going to fill in 1. There we go. So now the top face, the top extrusions are deleted. I want to do the same with the bottom one. Right, so to do that, we can just add a little math node, Shift A, math, and set this to add. And what do we want to add? Well, the same, so Ctrl Shift D, but then in the negative direction, so -1. Connect that back up to the adds, and you can see that we now have only the sides that are being extruded. Beautiful. Okay, next up, delete geometry, perfect. We have everything we need. But we need this to connect to other buildings instead of just going out for a meter, right? So how do we do that? Well, we can't use the geometry, or sorry, we can't use the proximity node. Reason why is because that will also connect to itself, basically, to its own little building. But if we use the raycast, we can actually specify the direction in which each point is going to look at to attach to pretty much, right? So whether that's going to be somewhere in the distance or a part further along, but, well, in the distance, it is going to be perfect, right? So let's hit Shift A, raycast, beautiful. And now we can access all of that information that we need, right? So we first need to give it a little bit of information, and that is going to be our collection info. So this one, I can just select it, Shift D, and drag it all the way to the right. Beautiful. So this is going to be our collection info. That's going to be the target geometry. Now, to do that, to use this, we need to realize those instances first. Shift A, realize instances. And now we can use it quite easily, right? So for the ray direction right now, it's going to look to attach or to, well, to detect other surfaces in the -1 direction, in the Z direction. And I don't want that to happen. I want this to be in somewhere near the normal direction, right? So let's access the normal once again. So drag this out. Name that attribute, and let's set this to the normal. There we go. And let's move this a bit more to the right again. Shift A, set position. There we go. And we want to set that second position, right, of the extruded parts to the raycast of the building, right, to where the end part of a cable is going to connect pretty much, right? So that's going to be the hit position. There we go. Now, this is a little bit weird, of course, and the reason why is because if a line can't find a raycast, if it isn't never hit another building, then it's just going to go to the origin location, which is not what we want, right? We only want the position to be set for the is hit, so for this, right? And the rest can go wherever it needs. We will delete that later. All right, so quite easy, quite beautiful. And what I'm going to look at next is how to delete whatever is not connecting to anything, right? So let's hit Shift A and delete geometry. And what I want to delete is pretty much everything that is not hit, right? So let's drag this out to a math node. There we go. And if I want everything except this, we need to set this to subtract and set this to be the second value and have 1. So this is going to be 1. Minus the is hit position, and then we are left with the is not hit position, if that makes sense. All right, so let's connect that up there, and then we will delete everything that is not connected somewhere. Right, so every building is going to look for a raycast in the normal direction, and once it hits the other building, that is the position where the actual endpoint of the geometry is going to be located. Right, so that's working quite perfectly. So what I want to do next is I don't want this all to go exactly in the normal direction. I want this to be looking a little bit to other or chaotic or random directions as well. Right, so that is something that is going to be defined by the raycast. The raycast ray direction, all right, and well, as well as the extrusion direction, but it doesn't really matter because that is overwritten by the ray direction pretty much. All right, so we can drag this a little bit to the left and we can alter this vector a little bit. And to do that, what we can do is just add a little bit of a random value to it so we can scatter it in multiple directions. So hit Shift A and find, let's say, a random, no, let's find a vector math first, connect it in there. And we can add whatever we want. You can see that it's already looking in diagonal directions. But I want the second little layer there to be a random value. There we go. And what do we want for minus? What do we want for maximum? Well, I'm thinking in degrees right now, not in radians. So I'm going to hit Shift A and find 2 radians. It should be, if I drag this out, it will find it. There we go, 2 radians. There we go. And we can connect the same value to the minus and the maximum. Hit Shift A. And we can actually just type in math with a little multiply value for the minus. There we go. We can just set this to multiply and -1, right? Because I want the minus and the maximum value to be in the different directions, right? So we actually have a minus degree and a maximum degree in which it's going to be looking for. And we can just set this, I want this 2 degrees from radians. No, 2 radians from degrees, my bad. And I want this to be like 45 degrees, right? If I do 90, it is going to still look in, well, pretty much 180 degrees angle, which is a flat, well, surface basically. And I want it to be more in like a 90 degree out angle. And you can just up that if you want pretty much, or lower it. Doesn't matter. So right now you can see that it's already attaching to random parts. Isn't that interesting? Yes. All right, so now let me just crank down the density of our points. And now we have our little lines, all right? Beautiful. Now, we know for a fact that our lines are attaching to a surface and not going through a surface, but from time to time when things are close, we may have a little line that goes through. Now, why is that? Quite easy, because we extrude our lines first with, well, where is it? We have an extrude mesh here, and the offset scale is 1. Right, and that means if I Ctrl-Shift-click on this node, we can see how far that is. It is incredibly far, right? If I just need the extra points basically. I don't even need the distance. So we can just set this to be 0.00001, right? Or maybe there's a little bit too little. We can't really see it, but we can see that we should still have our vertices. So if we delete our viewer node, we should still have our little extrusions. But now, if we extrude it here, it's actually going to attach nicely to that neighboring surface and not really go inside, as you can see. So that is perfect. So we just need a tiny little bit of extrusion and that will fix that. Nice, so we already have some kind of a cable connection going between buildings, which is perfect, basically. And we can now turn this into an actual cable, right? Because we have all the information we need. We have the points, and now all the way at the end, we can just turn this Shift-A mesh to curve. Beautiful. Nothing changes, but it is now a curve. Right, so what do we want to do to make this look more like a cable? Let's give it a little bit of a hang, a little bit of a dipping kind of motion. And the way we do that is to press Shift A. And we first need to turn this into, well, into a little bit more of a resolution, right? Because right now we have 2 points, which means that we can't really control where the midpoint is going to be, right? So we first need to give this a bit more detail, and I'm gonna do this by turning my spline, right, my curve, into an actual Bezier curve, right? So Shift A and search for a spline type, set spline type, and from the start it's poly, which means it's, well, right now it has 2 points, which means it's going to be a straight line from point to point. But if we choose a Bezier, there we go. Nothing changes still, but we now have access to handle types, right? So if we hit Shift A with a Bezier curve, you have handles, and that is going to define where well, pretty much the curve of the curve, yes, is going to be. So hit Shift A, and let's just find a set handle type. There we go. Now I don't want this to be an auto, but I want this to be, well, let's just set this to be a vector. Beautiful. That way, with a Bezier, the annoying part is if you have an auto, it is also going to add a little bit of a smooth curve to the starting points of your curve, and I only want that to be pretty much the midpoints of the curve. So I'm just going to set that to be a vector. There we go. And now for those handle positions, we can hit Shift A, set handle positions, all right, and then we can control the offset. And you can see that if I drag this down already, we are getting a little bit of a dip in the cable. Now, right now, we only have that in the left handle position, so we want that in right as well. Sadly enough, we can't really set this to both, so I'm just going to set this to left, duplicate it, and set the same value to right. And now you can see we have a beautiful little dip in our cables. All right, so we can actually control that, or at least keep this nice and even, by dragging this out into a combined XYZ. And, well, using the same vector for both of the handle positions, of course, and then we can control the Z position here. All right, so drag that down, and it will give our little cables a dip. Now, there's just one thing that I don't like, and that is that those little curves in between have the same amount of drip as those long ones, right? And I want this to depend a little bit more on the actual length of the curve, right? So to do so, we need a little bit of math, right? And the place where that's going to happen is in between these two little points, right? So if you don't have that little point, hold Shift, right mouse, and just drag across here. Beautiful. There we go. So that means we can do some math in between here, after which it will split to the two nodes. So combine XYZ. We have a Z value. We can drag that out, and we want this to be usable with, well, based on the spline length, basically, right? So if we have a spline length, Shift A spline length node, this is the length of each individual spline. It's the information for that. So what we want to do is right after we turn this to a curve, we want to capture this attribute, because that is the points where we have all of the curves that we can get the information of, right? So hit Shift A, and let's do capture attribute, swipe that in there, and let's connect the spline length to the value, and the attribute is going to be used to actually control, actually we don't even need this little point there. This is going to be used to control the Z value. So if I just crank that in there, you can see that it is beautiful, but it's the wrong direction, right? So let's just revert that direction by hitting Shift A, math, and I'm going to hit subtract. And this is going to be in the bottom, and it's going to be 1. Right, so this is too strong, way too strong. So we can hit Shift A, math, and we can multiply this. Here we go, with a lower value. Right, something like that maybe. Quite beautiful. So now those shorter cables are nice and tight, and those longer ones are dripping a little bit more. Okay, that's quite nice. Right, so if I want, I can even add a little bit of a random value for each cable, right? Random cable drippage. So just drag this out with a random value. Random value. And the value is going to be between 0.05 and 0.1, I guess. There we go. So now each cable has a little bit of a different drip amount. And we can just crank those values up or down later when we really want to use that. Maybe a little bit more drip will be nice, but we can control that later. It doesn't really matter. Let's just set this to a little bit higher. There we go. Beautiful. All right, so this is looking quite perfect. There's a lot of cables in the middle of our road, right? Nice. So let's just start off by creating an actual mesh out of that again. So let's drag all of this to the left. There we go. And this as well. Beautiful. Keep this nice and compact. And we can actually just hit Shift A, curve to mesh. And we can add the profile curve. We can have that be a curved circle. There we go. Set the radius a lot lower, of course. Something like that. And the resolution can be 4. That's low enough. Maybe 3 even. Something like this is fine. It's a little bit thick for my liking. So I'm going to hit Shift A, set curve radius. That is tilt. Set curve radius. There we go. And the radius is going to be a random value between 0.1 and 0.4 perhaps. So now we have each cable has a little bit of a different kind of thickness. Quite beautiful. Now, something else that I want to do is set the spline resolution. Right now, if you go close, we have got quite some segments in our curve, so we can control that by hitting Shift A, set, and we need that to be in front of our curve there. Shift A, set spline resolution. There we go. And now we can up or decrease that resolution depending on how much we need, right? So I'm going to set this at like 50 for now. It's fine. Something else I want to do is all the way at the start of my little geometry node setup, I want to be able to control from which height the cables start, right? So I don't want cables all the way at the bottom here, but I want cables to start, for example, halfway up. So we can do that by hitting Shift A and finding a position node. And this position node is going to, well, give us information of each point where it is located, and we can compare that, right? So let's drag this out to a separate XYZ, because we only need the Z value, and we can compare to, let's set this to greater than, and we can now just connect that greater than value to our actual points. There we go. Right, so if I set this to greater than, for example, let's say 6, it's going to start higher, at least it should. Let's see. I can Control Shift click on this value and Control Shift click on my points as well. And if I now drag this down, you can see that our points are actually going to be located, well, at the gradient line of this greater than node. So I think that the distributing points is actually not the right way to go, because we only have a limited amount of geometry on our actual object, which means that it's not really easy to add, well, a gradient or a greater than value in the middle of the face, right? Because there's just no geometry. So let's actually, instead of using this on the points node, let's actually connect this to the instance on points. There we go. That should be better. You can see that now we have much more control on where it actually spawns. So if I now delete my little viewer node, you can see that we can perfectly set where our cables are going to start and where they are going to, well, not start, I guess. You can see, beautiful. All right, so I want a little bit more of a random distribution of those cables, right? I want a little bit of a noise texture as well. I like noise textures. So hit Shift A, Math, there we go. And what we can do is set this to, I guess, to multiply and set the value to be noise texture. There we go. Let's decrease the detail and the roughness and up the scale a little bit. Shift A, find a color ramp. There we go. And I want the color to be connected and not the vector. There we go. Right, and we can Control Shift click on that multiply and the points. And we can actually see what is actually happening. Right, so let's crank these values a little bit closer. Here we go. Beautiful. And let's crank up the scale a little bit as well. So now only specific points will be instanced. There we go. Right, so if I now delete my viewer node, you can see that we have less cables scattering around in a more random order. And we can control that by the scale of the noise texture, but also by dragging the color ramp left and right, for example. Right, quite interesting. Beautiful. Now, what else should we do? I think I want to take a little extra step here because I think it will be fun. So what I did is I created some image textures, or not created, I asked AI to generate that for me, that we can actually use to scatter on these cables. And the fun thing with that is that we can scatter any type of image that we want. And the first thing that popped to mind was birds. I want birds on cables. So how do we do that? Well, it's very easy. All we need is an instance, an object that we can use to scatter on the cables. So Shift A, mesh plane, and I'm going to hit shader editor and new, and I'm gonna select my principled and hit Control T, and I'm gonna hit open, and I'm gonna locate my file. You may not be able to see that right now, but I'm just going to locate my file and I'm gonna add that there. So it's a crow, and you can just download this from me. I will add this to the description, and let's hit the alpha to the alpha. I'm gonna drag the, hello. Right, so we need cycles for that. it's easier. There we go. And we can now just decrease the specular and increase the roughness. Beautiful. Right, so we have one bird. So let's say I have more birds, which I have actually. Oh my god. Shift D. Hit new on the material and open your second kind of bird. There we go. Shift D. X. New. Open your third kind of bird. Here we go. Hello. That's not the third. This one? Yeah. So they're all a little bit different, but I made them all kind of the same so they can all sit on cables. Right? Very nice. So this may not look perfect in the end because it's not a 3D object. It's a little 2D bird, but it's quite interesting what we can do with it. So if I go to my cables, here we go. I can actually go back to my geometry nodes setup. There we go. And right there at the end of our tree, we have curve to mesh, but I want to work with the curves. So when we have the, let's go with the last type, the spline resolution here, we can drag this out and we can set this to be resample curve, because I want to still be able to control how many points I have that I use to distribute crows on, right? So I want this to be, for example, 30, and I want this curve to drag out to, let's say, an instance on points. There we go. And the instance I want to be my crows, right? So if I select my crows, all of them, hit M, hit new, and I'm gonna set this to crows, right? The crow collection, basically. Okay, so that's quite nice. Let's go back to our actual cables. And let's say we want that as an instance. I'm gonna drag in my crow collection there, and I'm gonna connect the instance to the instance. There we go. So let's hit Shift A, search, join geometry, there we go. And let's just connect the instances there as well. So now we have crows. Beautiful. Now this is not the right location. So let's just hit relative, separate children, and reset. There we go. Just hit all the buttons and see what works, I guess. That's what I do. And then we can scale everything down a little bit because those are big crows. Here we go. And now we have crows on cables, but they are not in the right kind of rotation, nor are they in the right direction of the actual spline. So what we're gonna do is drag this out, Shift A, transform geometry, and we can just rotate this to the correct axis, right? So let's just pick instance here first, so it doesn't distribute all the crows at the same spot. There we go. And let's rotate this. Let's see what is the right direction. This is good. And then the Z direction, I guess we need 90 as well. 90 degrees. There we go. So now we have all types of crows on our cables, but it looks a little bit repetitive, right? A little bit too repetitive, if you ask me. So to change that, we can very easily, first of all, change the random value of the scale. Right, drag that out, random value. And I want this to be a float. And connect that back up to the scale. There we go. Let's make this a little bit prettier. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. We can always make this better later. And the minimum value, 0.1, maximum 0.2, maybe even lower, right? Select them both and drag them down a little bit. Something like that. Crows need to be small compared to the buildings. There we go. Right, minus value 0.02. Don't go the negative direction, at least. That's gonna be weird. Something like that is quite interesting, I'd say. And I think the random value does a great job. And something we need to do is move the crows up a little bit, because right now they are not on the cables, but more in the cables, something like that. Right, so right now my birds are all facing one direction, which is pretty much fine, because if I render this as a still, I want all the planes to be rotated towards the camera pretty much, right? So I think we need a little bit of random, or not random, but manual tweaking of that if it is needed, right? So you can just tweak this Z value just so it matches your camera. And the reason I'm not actually rotating this based on the rotation value of my curve, right, direction of my curve, is because if you would sit on a wire in the sky, you would still want your body to be pretty much straight up, right? Otherwise, you have to constantly tense your muscles. So if you are sitting sideways is not comfortable at all, right? So crows will also sit up straight on a cable, which means we will not have to angle them really, right? Because this is perfectly fine, right? So I just want them to be a bit more close, and I don't want them to be this close to the buildings as well, right? They usually stick somewhere in the middle of the cables. So to do that, we can very easily go with the selection of the instance on points, and we can drag it out to an endpoint selection. Right, if this is going to be 1 and 1, we only have crows at the sides. So if I up this, you can see to, let's say, 9, we only have the sides and not the center. So if we want that to be the other way around, we need a math node, Shift A math, set to subtract with this in the second and this to 1. Right, so now we have crows only at the centers of our curves. Isn't that beautiful? All right, so I also want a little bit of, well, variation in where they are and where they are not. So what we can do is Shift A, math, multiply this with, you guessed it, a noise texture. There we go. Set this to 0, crank up the scale, Shift A, color ramp, okay, color ramp, there we go, and drag this a bit more closer, right? Something like this. Now, if we want crows closer together, like they are more like friends hugging, we can just crank up the count to 100, for example. You can see they're now very tightly packed, which is maybe a little bit too much. So let's set this to like 60, something like that. They're quite close. And then we can also just crank up this little texture so they are more scattered. Beautiful. And we can also move it a bit more away from the endpoints by cranking this value up there. All right, something like that. So to make this more what is it called? Procedural, I guess. We can hit Shift A and find an integer, right? So this is going to be an input value that we can set to 60 for the resolution. And then let's say for the start and end size, I want this divided by a number, let's say divide by 5. And we can connect that there and connect that there as well. So now that when we up our little value of 60 or decrease it, is also going to stay up pretty much the same space away from the buildings, if that makes sense. I guess it does. Right, something like this already looks quite decent in my opinion, right? So there's crows everywhere pretty much. So that is nice. Crows in our scene, amazing, right? So you can always try to change the scale here. If I set this to 1, for example, it is going to distribute more crows in only specific areas, right? So we have only a little bit, but more friendly together as well. So these are still quite the same crows, which is unlucky, I guess, right? So that is just the way the pick instance is working right now. These are nice and different, but you know, it's fine. So something like that, but I'm just gonna drag this a little bit back, set this to 50 again, something like that. Beautiful. Crows in the scene, just like that. Wasn't that easy? So that was pretty much it. You now know how to create your cable generator, right, with crows, and you can change those into, well, any object you want pretty much, and you'll be able to reuse it for any future projects. It's gonna save you a ton of time. So if for some reason you still want to just download this, you can in the description from Gumroad or from within the Blender universe as a drag and drop geometry node setup. It's gonna be very easy, it's going to be free, so why not try it out, right? Links will be down below. If you liked the video, please comment, subscribe, leave a little like. I will appreciate any one of those, and then I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!